I wanted to sort of do my reflection or craft my reflection around three sorts of short stories and long reflections, perhaps, for takeaway and reflection through the filter of the lens of my discipline, which is law. And the first of those is misrepresentations, including, which I think are frequently grounded in superstition, appeals to faith, and magical thinking. And I personally began my career as a consumer advocate, specializing in health law, in particular the buying and selling of purported medicines that made false claims. And my favorite case of all was a supposed cancer cure that was a salve made from the ash of Mount St. Helens, which had recently exploded, and then they sort of took the ash. And it was a very charming product, actually, if in a very medieval kind of way. It was sort of sold as something akin to a dip in the Ganges or a bottle of water from the River Jordan. And it was a lot of fun to prosecute, quite frankly, because there were really involved wholesale, raggedy, out-and-out charlatans, and we could roll our eyes about it and laugh, and largely because it wasn't backed up or offensive to any major religious belief system. And I wasn't having to deal with the profession of miracles, because nobody had actually been cured by it or believed that they had been cured by it. And yet, when I look at what's happening with the technologies that we came here to consider, I believe that there is a level of charlatanism no less insidious than the promise of a Mount St. Helen cancer cure that is revealed as ashes. What's more, so many of these technologies do have real effect, so the sense of promise is not without some foundation. And the promise of what precisely, however, is the subject of endless confabulation and hyperbole. And as a lawyer, I'm really concerned about the impact that the myths of infallibility, of genetic technology, that they're already having in shaping policy and law. And so they're completely disconnected with the underlying science. And so this is really an aspect of what I was trained to believe is false advertising, from outright laws to mislabeling to mere puff or exaggeration. It implicates the kinds of methodologies that are misaligned in this field as well. So we have differing statistical models used to analyze risk of disease that are the subject of quite legitimate concern in the GAO report that came out last week. We have different statistical models that are used in calculating the accuracy of matches in forensic DNA, whether through cold hits or familial tracking. These need alignment and examination. And of course, we have misrepresentation or false advertising as inspired by the gods of corruption through rank and pervasive conflict of interest. Researchers, university administrators, venture capitalists want to believe because they are praying to the great gods of profit, funding, equity, lucre, or maybe as the car talk guys put it, just how to make those boat payments. And it's not that they are lying, they really want to believe it. And then finally, under misrepresentation, the acting upon all of this before the results are in, so that courts are both shortening, actual courts are both shortening and lengthening sentences, for example, where someone can show MAOA. And not just because they come into court and are labeled with a warrior gene or having a warrior gene or an aggression gene or a gangster gene, but because of differing ideologies about the cause of this. Not the science, but the ideology underlying it. So in Italy, a sentence was mitigated because of the understanding that one couldn't help oneself because one had a gene for aggression. Whereas in the United States, courts are thinking about lengthening this because they ought to have known or they ought to put themselves in a position of being able to prevent this before it happens. The second concern and story I want to tell you is around the question of cognitive dissonance or framing or perceptual lens of the pathway problem that we've been discussing throughout this conference as well. Now, at least a decade ago, Rebecca Mead wrote in the New Yorker magazine about the first young woman to have broken a record in terms of price gotten from the harvest of her eggs. And it was a young woman whom I'll call Jane, who had answered an ad for Ivy League eggs. That is to say, the producer thereof had to be enrolled in an Ivy League institution, stand at least 5 feet 10 inches tall, be fair-haired and blue or green-eyed, have scores of at least 1,400, and a good health history. And Jane had been paid $50,000 for the same, a price that is now common and even on the low end for Ivy League eggs, and is common for many of my present students. So it's very hard to talk about the ethics in some of my classes about this. But I had the interesting experience of actually having had Jane in my class on law, politics, and social justice at the time this article came out. And so I talk about this with her permission. She was not private about this. although I will not use her real name. Now, if we had more time, I'd ask you to draw a picture of what or who you are imagining Jane to be. What would she look like? Would you be able to pick her out of a crowd of Columbia Law students and so forth? And so I just ask you to sort of click on an image in your head and hang on to what her profile brings to mind for you. Because you see, Jane did indeed stand out among my students as her as promised naturally blonde hair had been dyed purple and was twisted into some very long dreadlocks. Her skin was tattooed everywhere with engaging nests of writhing snakes, and she had an unusual number of piercings on every visible part of her body, which visible parts included her navel because she wore very short glitter bustiers to class. Now, Jane was indeed a standout in other ways as well. She had been an abused child, an abused woman, and had started a halfway home and prostitutes union, and was one of the smartest and most eloquent advocates I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. She also considered herself a pragmatic agent, a controller of her own body, and so she sold her eggs much more frequently than was medically recommended, but not yet regulated, and ended up missing 2 months of school when laid low by a serious infection as a result. But she got what she wanted, which was the ability to pay her way through Columbia and then put aside a little for real estate. She got a degree in return, and she was able to leverage that knowledge into all sorts of benefits for the cause and the constituents for whom she still works. Yet I still have problems with the individualized rational actor economic agent storyline by which she lived. And first, I worry that selling one's body in exchange for an education that will help you rescue other women who are selling their bodies and whose bodily integrity has been violated is a very complicated phenomenon. Second, I'm pretty sure that she wasn't the package that the egg purchasers or putative parents had in mind. And if you go back to the image of Jane from her paper or clinical profile that I asked you to sort of click on and compare it to the embodied Jane, well, the great distance between image, imagination, and embodiment, in other words, the actual expression, genetic, environmental, or otherwise, well, the gulf is particularly vivid and vividly ironic. Thirdly, Jane's best friend was a young black law student, and she had all the attributes Jane had, but for the blonde hair and blue eyes. She, too, would have liked to sell her eggs to put herself through law school, but there were no takers. So she was busy filling out the forms for scholarships and loans. So it's a cautionary tale when I hear us discuss either American culture as everybody here, or a younger generation within Western culture as all seduced by the joys of self-commodification. Let's be aware that this kind of generalization is premised on the continued invisibility, even at the local or domestic level, of certain actors or certain groups who are not considered to be of value in that marketplace. And that exclusion, whether de jure or de facto, describes a wall around the reproductive festivities, so to speak, an invisible sieve whose porousness is only transgressed by those who possess the valued traits of a given temporal era or a given culture or a given physical specification. And all this indicts the players who tell themselves that it's all about mere personal preference and improved options and freedom of market choice, and simultaneously that it is all about donation and altruism and generosity and helping those who desperately want children, family, love, love, love. The bottom line, I don't think these players want children. They, or we, want socially acceptable children. They want perfect children, and they don't just want intelligent children, or my black law student would have had egg seekers lining up the kazoo. They want racialized children, and they don't just want healthy children, or they wouldn't be insisting on tall or 5-foot 10-inch eggs. They want willowy, toweringly, supra-height normative children. And all this is an invisible component of what so many purchasers seek in this market for a child who is described as a child we can love. New reproductive technology, in other words, is no longer about reproduction in the sense of reproducing ourselves. It's about an art of crafting something bigger and taller and better and more foolproof, guaranteed to sail into the best preschools, through the best colleges, and the ultimate country club. And of course, this isn't new, but like the well-monitored breeding of royal lineages throughout the eons, it is to a very great degree about retaining material power through notions of inherent superiority, often with progeny as the crucible of that sense of superiority. And in stating it this way, I do mean to underscore the overtones of entitlement, for this is an old story whose structure is at the root of our most insidious isms: nativism, narcissism, class bias, racism, big brotherism, and colonialism. And all this is not just a eugenic or a class worry, it's a problem for family life. When you have paid $50,000 or $100,000 for a perfect egg that is Ivy League guaranteed and supposedly has, or is sold as, having the gene for violin, well, when the child comes out petulant and dyspeptic, takes up the bongos, and is just not terribly grateful for that price tag, well, you're actually beginning to see lawsuits around breach of promise. And I wish I had more time to go into that, because some of these are fascinating. But in short, one no longer expects one's children to be a fountain of surprises or to hold you hostage to fate. Rather, their genetic code is read as literally and as narrowly as a fundamentalist reads the Bible. The child, therefore, is a product whose warrantable features are standardized with a great and terrible faith. The third and final problem is what I call the Tower of Babel problem. And presently, I teach a class at Columbia that is offered not just to law students, but to graduate students from medicine, biology, journalism throughout the university, and as part of the core curriculum for selected college seniors. And the seminar is called Human Identity, DNA, and Scientific Revolution, and it's lots of fun. And I co-teach it with Bob Pollack, or Robert Pollack, the biologist whose words came at the very end of the film last night. And there are two other professors as well, a psychiatrist and a philosopher ethicist. And one of the things we are constantly working around is our very different senses of reference. Just take the word nature. It is a cellular reference to Bob Pollack. It is a behavioral or chemical pharmacological reference to the psychiatrist. To our philosopher, it invokes a moral ordering based in religious codes of natural law, like Vatican law. And as a lawyer, I hear it as a normative social descriptor. The word human. To Bob, it is a species boundary. To the psychiatrist, it is a fluid set of behaviors and intelligences that are not necessarily limited by the ability to mate as with a species, and can include parrots, apes, dolphins, elephants, and octopi. To the philosopher, human describes a frailty. And to me, as a lawyer, it is a status that invokes a set of principles and sometimes rights that are derived largely from international conventions premised on the notion of dignity. That's what human rights refers to. By contrast, in American law, the human is actually less important than the person. And a person is an entity, biologically alive or imaginary, human or fictive or dead, to whom certain kinds of legal protections are owed. Hence, corporations, municipalities, and universities can be persons in that they can sue and be sued. And they have standing and protection and recognition in our judicial and political system. So when one of our law students wanted to write a paper about how dolphins should be extended personhood for purposes of bringing suits to protect their habitat and right to exist, Bob was utterly confounded. And his response was, but dolphins aren't human. But in the United States law, humans are not the only persons. And this is also an interesting point of confusion when one begins to talk to international lawyers as well, for in those places outside of the United States where human rights have more resonance, humanity is rooted in a notion of dignity, and dignity is a kind of penumbra around the body, a social status that invokes respect in an interpersonal dynamic. So when Nicolas Sarkozy objected to a company that had produced a voodoo doll in his image, he sued for violation of his dignity, and actually won, albeit with a very limited remedy. In the United States, by contrast, such a suit wouldn't stand a chance on that ground, though it might be negotiated in some kind of sphere of privacy. And that's because personhood depends on an image of the body as discrete, not social, on the integrity of the body and the ability of individuals to control that integrity, and less on our being as socially stigmatized. Now, if there's this much subtlety and confusion in just this very small group of like-minded academics in our images of what a human being is, without genetic modification or other transhuman possibilities, well. So think also about how scientists, academics, researchers, and doctors imagine the power of genetics. Here, too, it's a kind of cognitive dissonance, a problem of internal translation. And I sometimes ask my students to draw a cartoon depicting how they imagine the DNA in their own bodies. And no matter how sophisticated their scientific backgrounds, what they draw is almost relentlessly pre-modern. It's a set, for example, of little drones circulating just beneath the skin. It's a little womb in the stomach with a fully formed self curled in a fetal position. It's a tiny scroll in a gold box just behind the thorax. That's my favorite. It's a mini brain with a little engine that's turning all the time. It's a biological Torah in the ark of the body. It's a homunculus in the alchemist's oven. And it seems to me that's perhaps the best image that I can come up with where we are in terms of the clash between what the science is actually telling us and the incredible cultural imagination that is somehow at the moment of alchemy and magical thinking. Thank you.